Hello and welcome to this short look at Al Capone's life, aka Scarface. Al Capone, aka Scarface, was born in January 17th, 1899, and he died in January 25th, 1947. Al Capone was born in New York and died in Miami, Florida. He was a notorious gangster during the Prohibition years. This is a photo of Al Capone with his mother when he was just a young fella. Al Capone was said to do pretty well in school, although he did have trouble with the rules as he was going to a Catholic college type of school. And at the age of 14, he was expelled for punching a female teacher in the face. After this incident happened, he worked odd jobs around Brooklyn, including a candy store and bowling alley. From 1916 to 1918, he played semi-professional baseball. After this, he was influenced by a gangster, Johnny Torrio, who he became to regard as a mentor. Johnny Torrio was aligned with the Chicago outfit. He went by a number of aliases: the Fox, the Brain, Papa Johnny, Terrible Johnny, and the Immune. Capone had belonged to the Junior 40 Thieves, the Bowery Boys, and the Brooklyn Rippers. They soon moved up to the 5 Points Gang. This is Bill the Butcher depicted here. He was in charge of the Bowery Boys originally and had the famous rival fight with the Dead Rabbits. An associate of Torrio, Frankie Yale, eventually hired Capone to bartend at the Harvard Inn, in a bar at Coney Island. If the 5 Points Gang sounds familiar, it's probably because you've seen the movie Gangs of New York, in which they depicted the battle between the Bowery Boys and the Dead Rabbits. As I said earlier, Frankie Yale hired Al Capone as a bartender, and as he was working the door, he inadvertently offended a woman, and he was slashed with a knife 3 times on the left side of his face by a brother, Frank Gulicio. The wounds led to his nickname, Scarface, which Capone loathed. In 1919, Capone left New York for Chicago at the invitation of Torrio. Capone began in Chicago as a bouncer in a brothel, which is thought to be the most likely place where he contracted his syphilis. Capone was aware of being infected at an early age, and the timely use of salivuricin, I think it's pronounced, probably could have cured the infection, but he apparently never sought treatment. During Prohibition, Capone was involved with Canadian bootleggers who helped him smuggle liquor into the US. When Capone was asked if he knew Rocco Perry, he was billed as the king of the bootleggers, he replied, "Why, I don't even know which side of the street Canada is on." In my own opinion, and being an Australian, I believe it's on the left side myself. In 1925, there was an ambush which left Capone shaken but unhurt. 12 days after this, Torrio, who was returning from a shopping trip, was shot several times. After this, he effectively resigned and handed the power over to Al Capone. Capone was only 26 at the time. Capone became the boss of the Chicago outfit in 1925, and his reign of 7 years ended in 1931 when they arrested him on charges of tax evasion. He was 33 when he was arrested. It's unknown how many people Capone actually murdered during his reign, but they could never pin any of the murders on him. He was responsible for the St. Valentine's Massacre, which we'll get to in a minute, but as well as many other things he did. But in the end, Elliot Ness and his Untouchables could only pin tax evasion on him, which got him out of the way for the time being. Originally, Capone was well liked by the public. He would go to baseball games and be cheered by fans when he was sighted. He used to make sizable donations to charities and was thought of as quite a modern day Robin Hood. And this all changed come the day, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The St. Valentine Day's massacre occurred in 1929. 7 men from the North Side gang were gathered at Lincoln Park Garage. About 4 or 6 men entered the garage, 2 of which were disguised as police officers, and on a ruse lined the men up against a wall, saying they were going to pat them down. They then were opened up on with Thompson machine guns and a shotgun. 70 rounds were fired, and as a result 6 of the victims died immediately. 1 lived a short while, but he refused to identify the killers. The men were waiting for a truck, and Morgan and his fellow gang members Willie Marks and Ted Newberry, who were running late on their way to the garage. Willie Marks and Ted Newberry were Morgan's bodyguards. The men inside the garage was Albert Kachatlek, alias James Clark, Morgan's second in command and his brother-in-law, Adam Heyer, the Northside Gang's bookkeeper and business manager, Albert Weinstack, Franks Gusenberg and his brother Peter. Frank and Peter were Morgan's enforcers. Frank Gusenberg survived a short time. He was taken to the hospital where a police sergeant, Clarence Sweeney of the Chicago Police Department, asked him, "Who shot you?" Gusenberg said, no one shot me." Sweeney said, "Frank, Pete's dead and you're in a bad way. Who shot you?" Gusenberg replied, "No one," and then he died shortly afterwards. This just went to show how deeply ingrained and how loyal the gangsters were to their code. Never speak to the police, keep your mouth shut. Even on their deathbed, they took it to their graves. There was 2 non-gang members at the present in the garage as well. You had Reinhard Schwimmer, a former optician turned gambler who liked to hang around with the gang, and John May, an occasional mechanic at the garage who had brought his dog Highball with him. May was fixing a wheel on a truck Vision at the time. George Bugs Moen, the leader of the Northside gang, was suspected to be the target that the people were trying to get. He was a direct rival to Al Capone in the Chicago outfit, and most people suspected that Al Capone definitely had his fingers in this pie of murder. As Moran drove past the scene when it was unfolding shortly afterwards, he saw what he thought was a police car. So he went around the corner for a cup of coffee to avoid what he thought might be a raid in progress on the premises and to see what the outcome would be. This saved him and his bodyguards' lives. Police arrested several gangsters on suspicion of murders, but lack of evidence meant that none were charged. In 1935, a gangster known by Byron Bolton did actually come forward and admit to being the lookout for the crime. The murderers, according to Byron Bolton, he named Fred Goltz, Gus Winker, Fred Burke, aka Fred Killerburke, Bob Carey, Three-Fingered Jack White and Tony Acedo as the men who actually were involved in committing the murder. In 1926, Capone was living in the 2 floors of the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, Illinois. While he was in the dining room, a man who was on the running board of a car driving past outside fired a machine gun of blanks into the air. Capone was about to see what was going on when Frank Rio pushed him to the ground. Frank Rio was Capone's bodyguard at the time. It's a good thing he did push him down at that time, because a motorcade of about 10 cars with Tommy machine guns, Thompsons, came past firing into the hotel trying to get Al Capone. The hit was organised by Jaime Wez and his crew were trying to take Al Capone out. Over 1,000 rounds were fired, but neither Capone nor Frank Rio were hit. When Capone was asked who was responsible for that drive-by shooting, he reportedly said, "Watch the morgue, they'll show up there." He also paid the medical bills of a woman who was sitting in a car and ended up with some glass in her eye. It was reported that she paid about $5,000 for her medical bills. During Capone's time as crime boss, he had a number of hits and contracts put out on him, and a number of attempts were made on his life. During this time, a former friend who turned enemy and joined a opposing syndicate, Joe Aurelio, he'd wanted the position for himself and had his nose put out of joint when it was offered to one of Capone's other colleagues. Aurelio plotted to eliminate both Capone and his second-in-command, and he went to the chef of one of Capone's favourite restaurants that he liked to go and eat at, offered him between $10,000 and $35,000 to put perusic acid in Capone's soup. But instead of doing this, the chef, who liked Capone, actually alerted him to the plot. Capone responded by dispatching men to destroy Ilirio's bakery with machine gun fire. More than 200 bullets were fired into the bakery, wounding Ilirio's brother Antonio. In the summer and autumn of 1927, a number of hitmen that Ilirio hired to kill Capone were themselves slain. In the end, Ilirio offered about $50,000 contract to anyone who could eliminate Capone. At least 10 gunmen tried to collect the bounty, but all ended up dead themselves. Capone was known for ordering his men to do his dirty work for him. In May of 1929, one of Capone's bodyguards, Frank Rio, uncovered a plot by three men, Albert Assimi, John Scalisi, and Joseph Gunter, had been persuaded by Aurelio to depose Capone and take over the Chicago outfit. Later on, Capone beat the men with a baseball bat and ordered his bodyguards to shoot them. This scene was depicted in the 1987 film The Untouchables. In 1930, when Capone learnt of the continuing plot against him by Aurelio, Capone decided it was time to eliminate him. Before the weeks of Aurelio's death, the men tracked him to Rochester, New York, where he was with the Buffalo crime family. They had a plot to kill him there, but Aurelio foiled that plot when he returned to Chicago before the plot could be executed. On October 23rd, after exiting a building to get into a taxi cab, a gunman in a second-floor window across the street started firing at Aurelio with a submachine gun. Aurelio was said to have been shot at least 13 times before he toppled off the building steps and moved around the corner, attempting to move out of the line of fire. But instead he moved directly into the range of a second submachine gun positioned on the third floor of another apartment block and was subsequently gunned down. Al Capone's days were numbered now. It attracted the attention of the newspapers, the police, and many other organisations which were wondering where he was getting all this lavish lifestyle from, and didn't seem to be paying taxes, which in the end, that's how they got him. He was indicted in 1932 for not paying his taxes and was sent to the federal penitentiary. Atlanta US Penitentiary to be exact. He was aged 33 years old at the time. Upon arriving at the penitentiary, he was diagnosed with syphilis and gonorrhea. Capone in prison was seen as a weak personality and so out of his depth dealing with bullying at the hands of fellow inmates. Lucky for Capone, there was another person sharing his cell called Red Renensky. Feared that Capone would have a breakdown, he found himself slowly becoming his enforcer. There was a rumour going around that Al Capone was receiving special treatment. There was no real evidence to this, but it did end up forming a rationale which ended him up being moved to Alcatraz prison. Capone was moved to Alcatraz, San Francisco in 1934. This was Al Capone's cell in Alcatraz prison. On June 23rd in 1936, Capone was actually stabbed and superficially wounded by a fellow Alcatraz inmate by the name of James C. Lucas. Lucas stabbed Capone in the back with a pair of scissors from a prison barber shop. After being stabbed in the back, Capone turned and grabbed Lucas and threw him into a wall. The inmates apparently were angry with Capone for not taking part in an inmate strike. Lucas later was sent to solitary confinement. Due to good behaviour, Capone was permitted to play his banjo in the Alcatraz prison band, the Rock Islanders. At Alcatraz, Capone's decline became increasingly evident as syphilis progressively eroded his mental facilities. His diagnosis was syphilis of the brain, was made in February of 1938. He spent the last year of his Alcatraz sentence in the hospital section, confused and disorientated. On January 6, 1939, he was transferred to the Federal Correctional Institution on Terminal Island in California to serve out the rest of his sentence. On November 16, 1939, he was paroled after his wife May went to the courts and argued that there was no point keeping him in jail as his mental capacity was just not there. He was spending most of his time confused and didn't realise where he was anyway. In 1946, his physician and a Baltimore psychiatrist examined him and concluded that Capone had the mentality of a 12-year-old child. He spent his last years of his life at Palm Island Mansion, spending time with his wife and grandchildren. And on January 25, surrounded by his family, in his home, died after his heart failed. Was transported back to Chicago a week later. A private funeral was held. He was originally buried at the Mount Olive Cemetery in Chicago in 1950. Capone's remains, along with those of his father Gabriel and brother Frank, were moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside in Illinois. And that's my take on Al Capone and the St. Valentine Days Massacre. Thanks for watching.